Alright, it is late. I just uploaded some artwork for Hulk action figures. I've been busy lately, guys. I've been working on some X-Men action figure artwork, Power Rangers stuff, Captain Marvel stuff. Haven't done any Avengers 4 stuff in a couple weeks, so we may be wrapped up on that. But it's just been crazy. Deadlines are just nuts. I'm tired, I'm stressed out, and I should probably go to bed. But I just opened a beer, so why don't you pull up a chair, get yourself something to drink. I got a story to tell.
Spider-Man, where are you coming from, Spider-Man? Nobody knows who you are.
I first discovered Spider-Man when I was about 4 or 5 years old. It was on a TV show called The Electric Company. It was kind of like Sesame Street without the Muppets. Morgan Freeman was a cast member at the time. And Electric Company had this segment called Spidey Super Stories, where they had Spider-Man would come in and he would fight these villains. They weren't the typical Spider-Man villains that you know from the comics, though. They were like made-up villains, like a guy who spoils kids' birthday parties and stuff like that. It was kind of pretty low budget. Spider-Man, he never talked. He never said anything. He communicated through thought balloons. He moved like a ballet dancer. I think the guy who wore the suit actually was a professional dancer. I don't even remember him ever actually hitting any of the bad guys. They just sort of like wrestled around. When he shot his webs, it was really low budget special effects. So they just sort of like took a net and they threw the net on the bad guy and that was it. But 5-year-old Scott thought it was the coolest thing in the world. And I watched Electric Company just for that segment, that Spider Super Story segment. Not too long after that, my mom introduced me into the Spider-Man cartoon, which was originally from the late 60s, but I hadn't seen it up to that point. Back then, there was no such thing as cable TV or satellite. You had the antennas, and there were like 2 dials on the TV, and one was a UHF dial, and the other was a VHF dial, and the UHF dial had like 4 channels, and the UHF dial had 2, and one of those channels was Spanish speaking for half the day. But in the early hours, it showed Spider-Man cartoon, and so that's why I really got introduced into the real Spider-Man, because that's when I got to see his Electro and the Rhino and Sandman and the real Spider-Man villains. And I got to hear him talk too, and you got to hear the wisecracks and things. So I became a hardcore Spider-Man fan when I was in kindergarten. So much so that at Halloween that year I decided I wanted to be Spider-Man. Spider-Man costumes that year, they were ugly. It was like Spider-Man has like a yellow costume. I mean, it wasn't whole yellow, but parts of it were yellow, and I hated it. Like, Spider-Man didn't have any yellow on his costume, it was red and blue. So my mom agreed to hand make me an original Spider-Man costume. I remember going to the department store with her and standing there while she shopped for the parts, and we went over to the girls section, and she bought a pair of blue tights, and I remember getting upset because I didn't want to wear girls' tights. She had to explain to me that they didn't make tights for boys, and so I just sort of dealt with it. The mask was made out of a red ski mask with a hairnet over it for the web pattern, and then she sewed actual like white eyes. It was white fabric for the eyes. I could barely see out of the damn thing, but I didn't care. It was cool. That was a fun Halloween. I really enjoyed that. For Christmas of that year, my grandma sewed me a Spider-Man doll. I still have it. In fact, I pulled it out of storage. He's right here. He only has 1 glove left, and he only has 1 boot. But what do you want? This thing's over 40 years old at this point. I still have him. A few months later, for my birthday, because my birthday's in February, so birthday of 76, I remember getting these Spider-Man web shooter dart guns. They would wrap around your wrist just like the web shooters, and you'd hit the button and they'd shoot these darts. I guess my family didn't coordinate things too well, because I got 5 of them that year for my birthday, and it was a good thing that I got 5 of them, because my mom kept taking them away from me because I accidentally would shoot my sister in the face. Accidentally. About that time, spring of 76 or so, I was at my cousin's house, and my cousin, he's older than me. He was about 12 or so at the time, and he had decided that he was done reading comic books. And he came to me, and he had heard what a big Spider-Man fan I was, and he asked me if I had heard of any of the other Marvel superheroes, and I really wasn't familiar with them. And he told me about Thor and the Avengers and Fantastic Four and Daredevil and got really excited about all these new different characters. And he showed me his comic book collection of all these different comics. And then he gave me his whole collection. It was about 400 comics. That was spanning from like 73 to 75 Marvel comics. We're talking Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Avengers, not just new stuff too, but reprints. And so, you know, the Marvel's Greatest Comics was like the Fantastic Four reprints of the Kirby years, and Marvel Tales of the Romita years, and for Spider-Man. There was even some Marvel Triple Action in there, which reprinted the Avengers stuff, and it was just a fantastic collection to be introduced into comic books. What you got to understand is that era, that was the sweet spot of the Marvel Bronze Age. There's like a 2-year period there, from the middle of 73 to like 75 or so, where you had the death of Gwen Stacy and the death of Green Goblin and the introduction of the Punisher and the introduction of Wolverine and the introduction of Iron Fist and the introduction of Moon Knight and the release of Giant Size X-Men #1, which introduced all of the new X-Men and would eventually relaunch that title. Most of those key books were in that collection that I received. It was great time to read Marvel Comics. You know, for the next several years, I would just read and reread and reread those same comics over and over and over again. I had hundreds of them. That particular era, that early mid-70s era of Spider-Man, that was the Gil Kane time frame where he was doing the art on Spider-Man. When people think back to their favorite artists on Spider-Man, Gil Kane's name is not often brought up, and I think it's because when you transition from the John Romita years to the Gil Kane years, there wasn't a huge stylistic art shift. It doesn't look significantly different than what Romita was doing by himself. And the reason is John Romita was inking over Gil Kane's pencils. Kane was doing a lot of work for Marvel at that time. Gil Kane would do really loose breakdowns, and then John Romita would come in and do quite a lot of finishing work. So that's why there's not a huge stylistic shift there, because there's still a lot of John Romita on those pages. But the difference is that Gil Kane brought just an extra amount of drama and action and body language. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Romita's work, but like the Gil Kane and John Romita art team on Spider-Man, I think is one of the most underrated art teams in comics. And that's my Spider-Man. So really, between the years of 75 and 83 or so, all of my comic book reading was just that core collection. When I got into junior high, 7th and 8th grade, I met this other kid named John, and John was reading the new comics. I would hang out with him and go over to his house, and he would show me all the new stuff. The Hulk is hitting issue 300, and there's this great artist named John Byrne, and he's on the Fantastic Four. He got me interested into what might be happening in new comics. So I would hang out with John, and he kept saying, well, I buy my comics from this comic book store. Maybe my mom could drive us to the comic book store. I'd never heard of a comic book store. The idea of one store that only sold comics was completely foreign concept to me. And it took a while. And finally, in the spring of 1984, I finally walked into my first comic shop. Unicorn Comics in Lombard, Illinois. The owner's name was Terry. His mom would sit behind the counter, and she handled the money. We walked in, and he greeted me and he said, hey, how are you? And, you know, how can I help you? And I kind of explained I really hadn't read any new comics in a long time. I had a bunch of comics from the 70s, so I asked him, what's new? And he's like, well, there's this new hot thing called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and issue number 2's on the shelf, and I've got a second printing of number 1 here if you're interested. I'm like, sure, it's got ninjas. And so I picked up those issues of TMNT, and I said, well, what's going on with Spider-Man? And he's like, well, he's got this all new black costume now. Like, they changed his costume. Like, how did that happen? He's like, we don't know. We have no idea how he got this black costume. Apparently we're going to find out in this limited series called Secret Wars that just started. I said, okay. So I picked up Amazing Spider-Man, and I picked up Spectacular Spider-Man, and I picked up Marvel Team Up, and then I picked up Secret Wars. And that was my introduction of, I guess, phase 2 of my comic book collecting years. It took 8 months of reading Spider-Man comics with the black suit before we finally found out how he got that damn symbiote. And honestly, it was kind of a letdown. But at the same time, it was a great time to be a Spider-Man reader. 84 is the year I graduated from 8th grade, and then later on in the year I started high school. And those high school years of mine, that 84 to 88, was a really just wonderful time to be reading Spider-Man. That was the black suit era. We had the Hobgoblin years. You know, Hobgoblin was like the main big villain of the early 80s. And then after that wrapped up, there was Craven's Last Hunt, one of the most influential, important Spider-Man storylines. There were certain things that went on in the way they told that story, getting away from thought balloons and just using the narration boxes. Certainly they didn't originate the idea. This was just on the beginning edge of certain things. It was one of the early storylines that captivated the audience so much that it kind of forced Marvel's hand into doing a collected edition, a trade paperback of the story, which generally wasn't done back then. So if you haven't read the Craven's Last Hunt storyline, seek it out. Even understanding now that a lot of the tropes that you may see in modern comics go back to that era of comics in the mid-1980s when The Dark Knight Returns was coming out with Frank Miller and Alan Moore's Watchmen. And I think that Craven's Last Hunt needs to be recognized. In 1988, I was a senior in high school, and Todd McFarlane took over Spider-Man as the artist. And I certainly acknowledged the fact, I mean, his cartoony style really lent itself to contorting Spider-Man's body in crazy different positions, which was cool. And the way Todd drew the webbing was really innovative and different. And so I got that. I understand why people gravitated for it. But for me, I didn't care for it at first, and it took a while for it to grow on me. Eventually, I did appreciate it. I was a senior in high school, and I was dating girls, and my enthusiasm for comics, it wasn't quite as bright as it was 4 years earlier. After I graduated high school, you know, I was into role-playing games and comics and Star Wars and Doctor Who and all these sorts of different things. And I enrolled at Columbia College in downtown Chicago. My initial intention was to be a writer. Early on in the process, I decided to switch majors and become an artist instead, because I just decided that if I'm going to do something for a living, I want to draw Spider-Man. So for the next 2 years, I was taking art classes, and it was an interesting experience for me. And I was still going to the comic shop weekly, still buying Spider-Man comics and Avengers comics and a lot of different stuff. But I wasn't getting the art education that I wanted. The teachers were commercial art driven, and they wanted me to draw Pepsi cans and Big Macs and do advertisements, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to draw dragons and robots and monsters and Marvel superheroes. So in 1990, I transferred to Northern Illinois University. At Northern, they had an illustration teacher on staff. His name was Mark Nelson, and Mark was, in the day he taught classes, and at night he was a working artist in both comics and games, and he would do Dungeons & Dragons artwork, but he also did comic book work, and he would ink over Mike Mignola's stuff, or he would work on comics written by Joe Lansdale. But what he was most well known for was being the artist who drew the original Aliens miniseries for Dark Horse Comics. So having him as an art teacher was a real good influencer for my career coming up. The other big thing that happened to me when I transferred to Northern was that the university just randomly placed me with a roommate in the dorms. And this roommate was the biggest Spider-Man fan I have ever met. He was an 18-year-old freshman coming in, and he had already bought an Amazing Spider-Man #1. I think he paid like $80 for it. I had never even seen a Silver Age Spider-Man book at that point. My local comic shop, Unicorn, they weren't really into the Silver Age stuff. I mean, they had long boxes and they had plenty of back stock, and there was some Bronze Age stuff in the long boxes you could dig through. But really, for wall books, they were more of an independent-minded type of store where they had things like the Ninja Turtles and Elf Quest and The Crow and books like that. When I was introduced to this new roommate, his name is Art. Art and I became fast friends. His local comic shop was really into the Silver Age stuff, and they had the wall books of the Silver Age. It was kind of an interesting friendship that we formed, because he introduced me into an all new type of collecting, and that would be an interest in Silver Age books. I had a car, so what we would do is on the Wednesdays, he and I would walk down to the shop at the university there, and right next to the university bookstore, and we would buy our new comics. And so at this point, I was still a continuous reader of Marvel comics, and I was reading X-Men and Spider-Man and all the Spider-Man books. At this point, I was picking up Web Spider-Man, Spectacular, everything. and so was he. But we'd also go back issue shopping on the weekends. And so this was before the internet. We didn't have smartphones or anything like that. There was no World Wide Web, so we would have to get out the phone book and flip through the yellow pages and try and locate what comic shops we wanted to hit for that day on a Saturday. And then we would get out a big paper map and unfold the big paper map and plot out our course for the day. And we'd figure out, okay, we're going to go to this comic shop first, then we're going to drive to this town and go to this comic shop, and drive to this town and go to this comic shop. And that's how we would spend our Saturdays, just driving from store to store and digging through long boxes. It was a fun time. And because we were both Spider-Man collectors, I was kind of working on an Avengers run at that point, and so if he found a Spider-Man book that he wanted, I'd let him have it. But any times that we found Spider-Man stuff that he already had in his collection, I would grab it, because I was concurrently building an Avengers run as well as a Spider-Man run. And this too is the time period where, like I said, he introduced me into Silver Age collecting. Unfortunately, getting into the independents of the 80s, that was a much more volatile market. Like one week you'd have a hot book and the next week it would crash. And then one week you'd have a super hot book that would be really expensive and then it would crash. And all those books had low print runs, but you know what? Just because a book is rare doesn't mean it's worth anything. If there's no demand, nobody cares, it's not a good investment. So I've got a whole box of independent books from the 80s that are worth nothing, even though I was dropping 20, 25 bucks on them a piece when they first came out. So he explained to me, he's like, no, the tried and true stuff, the old stuff that people care about, that's what you got to go after if you are interested in it holding monetary value for the future. And I said, okay, great. What about first appearance of Spider-Man? And he's like, you're not going to afford that. I'm like, okay, well, my second favorite character is Captain America. How about that? He's like, well, Captain America Comics #1 is out of your price range, but I bet you we can get you into an Avengers 4. So he and I went to his hometown, and we went to a few shops, and we found an Avengers 4 in about fair condition or so. It would eventually grade out to about a 3.0 later on, but I paid 50 bucks for it, I remember at the time, and I was happy with it. And that began my love affair with Marvel Silver Age books. Now, over the next few years, I wouldn't limit to myself to just that one. And at the same time, I was kind of transitioning in my tastes. Marvel and DC, they stopped marketing books to the readers, and they were purely just pumping books to the speculators at that point. And in fact, all superhero books, whether it was even the New Image books. I guess the publishers figured out that it was easier to try and capitalize on the speculator market and sell 5 copies of the same book to one collector than try and expand their audience, 5 times. I would get sucked into it, and I read when McFarlane came out with his new Spider-Man series, I bought all the covers for that one. And then when Jim Lee came out with his X-Men series, I bought all the covers for that. And I bought 15 comics of X-Force in one. But after a year or two of it, I just got really sick of it all. The quality wasn't there. So I stopped buying new comics in around 1992. It just burned out. And I stuck with Valiant for a while. I was looking for something a little bit more quality, and I read Valiant for about 2 more years. But by '94, even Valiant had gone down the tubes. They had gotten bought out by a video game company, and it just wasn't that good anymore. So I really kind of stopped regularly buying comics at that point. Also, the other thing by 1994 was, I was starting on my own career as a professional artist. I was working at a t-shirt shop doing t-shirt designs in the day, and then at night, I would be doing artwork for role-playing games. Games like White Wolf Game Studio had me on their games like Mage the Ascension and Werewolf and Vampire and things like that. And I did a little bit of Dungeons & Dragons work, and I did a little bit of Star Wars role-playing game work. I sent out portfolios to all the big comic book companies, Marvel, DC, Image. I got rejected by everybody. I got a very interesting rejection from Image. That's a story for an entirely different video. But also preparing for my wedding. I was getting married at that point. And so, life changes. So, I often wonder, really, what was it? Why did I lose interest in buying new comics at that point? Because I know there's a lot of guys who were getting into comics right around 92 and 93, and all that speculator crap is what drew them in. And they look fondly at that time as kind of like their golden age. But I don't know. Maybe it was just a combination of me getting older, my priorities changing, comics and the way they were being sold and the stories that were being told were changing too, and it just wasn't my cup of tea anymore. Even though I was done with buying new comics, I continued to collect older books, Bronze Age books, Silver Age books. And Art and I, we weren't living together at that time anymore, but we would still get together and go to conventions. So during this time, we would actually be a bad influence on each other because we would just talk each other into spending money on books. But that's when I accumulated a collection of Silver Age stuff. That's when I bought, my Captain America 100 and my Iron Man #1 and just various Silver Age Spider-Man issues. My first appearance of, first Craven, first Scorpion, first Shocker. I continued to be a collector, even though I wasn't really reading new comics anymore. And I remember at one point, and again, this was mid-90s, somewhere in the mid-90s, I remember thinking, there was one comic book that you could get. What would it be? And I said, it's got to be Amazing Fantasy 15. So I remember looking in the comic buyer's guide, flipping through the comic buyer's guide, and I see an ad. I don't remember what grade it was, but they wanted $1,300 for it. I was like, damn, I will never own an Amazing Fantasy 15. Because I knew no matter how old I got and how much money I would make, the book would just continue to raise in value. So I said, all right, I guess I'm just going to stick to buying the cheaper stuff that I could afford. So occasionally, my old college buddy Art, he would come to town and we would go to a convention and I'd buy a few books here and there and he would buy a few books and we'd have a fun day and then we would go home. And that was really just the limit of my comic book collection there in the 1990s was just limited to 1 or 2 conventions a year, going, buying the affordable keys that I could. Particularly now, I was just almost exclusively focused on things like Spider-Man and the Avengers. And that was it. And I continued to work on my career. I just was working ridiculous hours. Mid to late 90s, I'd work an 8-hour shift at the t-shirt shop. I'd come home, I'd had dinner with my wife, I'd sit down at the drafting table, and then I'd work another 8 hours doing role-playing game artwork. I would go to bed, I'd get about 4 hours of sleep, wake up and do it all over again. That was Monday through Friday. And then on Saturday, I'd probably put in another, instead of 16-hour workday, I'd only put in an 8-hour workday at the drafting table. And then maybe on Sunday, I would put in 4 hours. It was just a ridiculous work schedule. I quit my day job in 1999, and by that time I had also really kind of stopped buying Silver Age stuff, and I had pretty much forgotten about the collection. I still had all the books in the closet, but I wasn't buying anything new. I was trying to transition from being just an interior fantasy artist, just drawing dragons and stuff with pen and ink, to being a cover artist. And for the next few years, I taught myself color art, training myself on this new digital illustration techniques. In 2003, I decided I really wanted to get back into the comic book market. I had already sent some samples in to Games Workshop, who produced a game called Warhammer 40K. In 2004, I started doing a few covers, comic book covers for them, and so I decided to put together a few samples and try and send them to Marvel and DC. Now, back then, this was before variant covers were big. They just didn't hire just plain cover artists out of the blue. Unless you were a name that they could market and it would boost sales for the book just on your name alone, they really weren't going to hire you as a cover artist. They wanted you to do interiors first and prove yourself doing interior art before doing it. And I didn't really get that at that time. So I worked up a Batman portfolio piece and a Spider-Man portfolio piece, and I sent them off to DC and Marvel. And I emailed a Batman piece to every single Batman or DC editor I could find. And I got back some good feedback from DC, and then I got an email from their actual talent coordinator, and he tersely told me to stop spamming the DC offices. Marvel, on the other hand, I got a phone call, and the phone call wasn't from the comic book department, it was from the merchandise department, and he told me that he loved my sample that I sent him. He's like, he wanted to use it, and he asked me if I was available to do more work for them. They were going through a time period where they were switching over. They had been using on all their toys the Ultimate Spider-Man stuff, but word from Walmart and Toys R Us was they wanted to change, and apparently I was the style that they were looking for. So I immediately began working as a merchandise and toy artist for Marvel. Between 2003 and 2008, I was the primary Spider-Man artist on all Marvel toys, action figures, games, everything. If you walked in to a Walmart or a Target or a Toys R Us or any place and saw Spider-Man merchandise during that time period, that was my Spider-Man. In 2007, after Marvel had formed their own movie studio, focus had to be shifted to the new Marvel movies that were coming out. So they took me off the Spider-Man merchandise, and they had me focus on the Marvel movies. And I have contributed artwork to the merchandise and the toys associated with every Marvel movie since. It's pretty much been my full-time job for the past 10 years. In between there, I would still get to work on some Spider-Man stuff here and there. I got to do, even though it wasn't a Marvel MCU movie, I did some merchandise art for the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movies. I actually have one on, that right there is a piece I did for the Andrew Garfield Amazing Spider-Man movie. I've got a couple more like that I did. When there was a new Spider-Man cartoon that would come out, I would work on the Spider-Man stuff too. So it was a kind of a nice, it was constant like movie merchandise, movie merchandise, movie merchandise, and then a Spider-Man cartoon, and then a movie merchandise and a Spider-Man cartoon, that kind of stuff. And that's what I've been doing. You know, what my goal of when I switched my major from being a writer to an artist back in, 1988, because I wanted to be a Spider-Man artist, that came true. A couple years ago, in 2016, my buddy Art was here. He was hanging out because he was in town to do Wizard World Chicago. He's got a full-time job, but he's a dealer on the side. He's a regular on the CGC boards. And he says, have you thought about your collection at all? I'm like, it's in the closet. I have them. I don't know. He's like, well, let's go through and see what you have. I started going through my books, and he started pulling stuff out. We should get some of these graded and send them off to CGC and just see what we've got. And I didn't know anything about slabbing books or anything like that. So he explained it all to me, and he told me how, and he sent off a bunch of my books to get graded under his account. That kind of reignited my passion for collecting it, and to get those books out from the dark closet and out from the boxes. I really appreciate the books that I have. It was a cool thing. A new phase of my comic book collecting had begun again. So over the past 2 years, I've been back into it. I've been back collecting again. Like usual, I got back into, Spider-Man and the Avengers. It's just those are the two for me. And I realized, I've got a lot of books. I can sell these off and take the money and reinvest them into new books that I would want, because I don't need to have 4,000 or 5,000 books sitting in my closet. I'd rather just sort of take that money and reinvest it into a smaller collection of things that were kind of sentimental to me and kind of brought me back to my childhood. What was that one elusive book that I would want? And I realized, I'll never own an Amazing Fantasy 15, but I bet you I could afford an Amazing Spider-Man #1. So that became the new goal. I would sell comics to build up the money so I could buy an Amazing Spider-Man 1. Now, 2 years ago, this was a great plan. Apparently, there were a lot of people in the market who also had the same plan, because the price of Amazing Spider-Man 1 began to just shoot up like crazy. And it was really frustrating, because the more books I sold, I would build up new money, and the price of the book just kept going up and up and up, and I would just be chasing this book that I wanted, because I wanted kind of a mid-grade book, and it got to just ridiculous. For the cost of a mid-grade ASM 1, I might be able to afford a low-grade Amazing Fantasy 15. But that was a crazy idea, because I've always told myself I'd never own an Amazing Fantasy 15. And then one day I kind of looked up on my shelf here, and I saw my Avengers 1 and those other books, the Avengers 4 and the Iron Man 1, and all those different books. And a lot of these books that I bought back in the 90s, the price of them, the value, had gone up 10 times in the last 20 years. I added it all up, including the Hulk #1 181 that I had since I was a little kid, since that came in that original collection when I was 5 years old. There was my path. If I sold those books, I could afford an Amazing Fantasy 15. I'd have to blow up the collection. I'd have to sell everything. But I knew if I didn't, I might never be able to afford it. So that's what I did. I blew them all out, because I knew that I needed a big war chest to strike, because, I didn't want to overpay. If I was going to do this, if I was going to buy an Amazing Fantasy 15, I had to have the war chest ready to strike when an opportunity presented itself, because I didn't want to miss an opportunity. And then one day, an opportunity fell into my lap. Never say never, guys.